Hey everyone, welcome back. Today's story is about something most people never see, the exact moment grace breaks through a hardened heart. Padre Pio saw it. He described it as watching light enter a place where only darkness had lived for decades. Among all the visions he witnessed, souls, angels, purgatory, heaven, few things moved him as deeply as this. The sight of divine mercy piercing through what everyone else believed was impossible. He said it looked like a crack appearing in stone, followed by a beam of light so precise, so unstoppable, that the darkness had no choice but to dissolve. This wasn't poetry to him. It was something he saw with his own eyes, something that changed the way he understood how God reaches the unreachable. One afternoon, a woman came to Padre Pio in the confessional. She was trembling, her voice barely steady. She told him about her father, a man who had not set foot in a church for over 30 years. He had refused priests at every turn, cursed at the mention of God, and lived in a bitterness so deep that the family had given up trying. He had grown old in his anger, his heart like iron. She begged Padre Pio for help, but even as she spoke, her voice carried no real hope. She had prayed for decades. Nothing had changed. She believed her father would die the way he had lived, closed, cold, unreachable. Padre Pio listened quietly, his face serious but calm. When she finished, he asked her a few simple questions. How old was her father? Did he ever speak about his past? Was there any moment, even small, when he had softened? She answered each one, her answers painting the picture of a man entrenched in refusal. 30 years without the sacraments, 30 years of walls built higher and thicker with every passing season. Then Padre Pio said something that surprised her. "I will pray for him." The woman looked at him, confused. She had expected comfort, perhaps, or gentle words about accepting God's will. But Padre Pio spoke with a certainty that felt almost out of place. "Why would this time be different?" she asked quietly. Padre Pio met her eyes. Because grace has no limits. Days passed, then weeks. The woman returned to her father's home, hoping for some sign, some shift in the man who had hardened himself against God for so long. But there was nothing. He remained the same, distant, cold, unwilling to speak about anything that touched on faith or the church. The walls he had built showed no cracks. She began to doubt whether Padre Pio's prayers could reach someone so closed off. She had seen miracles in other people's lives, heard stories of conversions and healings, but her father seemed different. His refusal felt absolute, yet something was happening that she couldn't see. Back at the monastery, Padre Pio was praying constantly for this man. The friars noticed it. During Mass, Padre Pio would pause, his eyes distant, as if he were watching something unfold in a place no one else could enter. He would pray the rosary with unusual intensity, his fingers trembling slightly over the beads. One evening a friar found him in the choir after Vespers. Padre Pio stood alone before the tabernacle, his gaze fixed on the empty air to his left. His face was strained, almost pained, and tears moved slowly down his cheeks. The friar approached carefully. "Father, are you all right? Do you see something?" Padre Pio did not turn. His voice was quiet, steady. "I see a battle." The friar waited, unsure what to say. Padre Pio continued, still looking at the invisible scene before him. "The soul does not know it yet, but heaven is fighting for him." He explained later that grace was not silent or passive. It moved, it pressed, it knocked on the door of the heart with a patience that never tired. Even when the soul refused to answer, grace remained, persistent, gentle, relentless. "Heaven never stops," he said. "It waits for the smallest opening." Padre Pio often said that grace works on hardened hearts in a way most people do not understand. He explained it this way: grace is like water seeping into stone. It does not break the stone. It softens it slowly, drop by drop. He believed that hardened hearts resist openly, loudly, with anger and bitterness, but beneath the surface, they cannot resist the persistence of grace. Every prayer, every mass, every quiet plea to heaven becomes another drop pressing into the cracks no one can see. He told his spiritual children that when they prayed for someone who seemed unreachable, they should not expect immediate results. "Do not pray for sudden conversion," he said. "Pray for one crack in the wall, just one. Heaven will do the rest." Padre Pio insisted that hardened hearts were not hopeless. In fact, he believed the opposite. The hardest hearts, he said, often produce the greatest saints once they break. He had seen it happen too many times to doubt it. Souls who had spent decades running from God, once they finally turned, often ran toward him with a strength and humility that astonished everyone who knew them. But the key, he said, was patience. Grace moves at its own pace, in its own time. It does not rush. It does not give up. It waits for the soul to take one breath, one step, one small moment of vulnerability. And then it enters. And then something small happened. Most people missed it entirely. One morning, the woman visited her father as she always did. She brought him breakfast, sat with him quietly, asked how he was feeling. He answered with the same gruffness he had carried for years. But as she was leaving, he did something unexpected. He paused at the window. He stood there for a long moment, looking out at the church on the hill just beyond his house. He said nothing. He did not cross himself or pray. He simply looked. Then he turned away and went back to his chair. The woman thought nothing of it. A glance at a building meant nothing. Her father had lived near that church for decades and had never once entered it. Why would a moment of quiet staring change anything? But when she mentioned it to Padre Pio during her next visit to the monastery, his face changed. The weariness she had seen in him for weeks lifted. He looked almost relieved, and something like joy softened his eyes. "It has begun," he said quietly. "Grace found the crack." She did not understand. Padre Pio explained that what seemed like nothing to her was everything to heaven. The soul had allowed itself one moment of curiosity, one pause in its refusal. That was enough. He described it as ice beginning to melt under sunlight, slow, invisible at first, but unstoppable once it started. Then he told her something that frightened her slightly. "Do not stop praying now. This is the most dangerous moment." Within days, everything changed. The woman returned home one afternoon to find her father restless. He was walking back and forth in the small sitting room, his hands clenched, his face drawn. He would not sit. He would not eat. When she asked him what was wrong, he brushed her off, but his voice lacked its usual hardness. There was something else in it now. Confusion, maybe fear. That night she heard him pacing in his room. She stood outside his door, listening. At one point she thought she heard him cry out, though the words were unclear. In the morning his eyes were red, his face exhausted. She called Padre Pio immediately. "Something is happening to my father. He's not himself. He won't speak to me. He barely sleeps." Padre Pio's response was immediate. "He is waking up. Pray without stopping." Back at the monastery, Padre Pio intensified his prayers. The friars saw him in the choir that evening, kneeling before the tabernacle, his whole body trembling. His rosary hung from his fingers, barely moving. He was staring at something no one else could see, his face a mixture of awe and sorrow. One of the younger friars approached him carefully, worried. "Father, are you all right?" Padre Pio did not look away from the invisible scene before him. His voice was barely a whisper, thick with emotion. "Do you see the light? It is breaking through." The friar saw nothing but the empty air, and Padre Pio's tears streaming down his weathered face. What Padre Pio saw in that moment, he described only once. The friars who heard it never forgot. "I saw his soul," Padre Pio said later. "It was dark, locked, like a room with no windows, no doors, just walls. And the soul was inside, alone, convinced it would stay that way forever." He paused, his voice quieter. And then a crack appeared. Padre Pio described it as thin as a thread at first, running vertically through the darkness, and from that crack a single beam of light entered, narrow, precise, unstoppable. It did not flood the room, it did not shatter the walls, it simply touched the darkness, and the darkness began to dissolve wherever the light reached. "The soul gasped," Padre Pio said, "not in pain, in relief, like someone who had been holding their breath for 30 years and finally exhaled." At the exact moment Padre Pio saw this vision, something happened in the world outside the monastery. The woman's father stood abruptly from his chair, his face pale, his hands shaking. He looked at his daughter with an expression she had never seen before. Not anger, not bitterness, but something raw and frightened. "I need a priest," he said. She stared at him, unable to speak. He had not asked for a priest in 3 decades. He had refused them, cursed them, driven them away. Now he stood before her, trembling, his voice breaking. "Please, I need confession." She brought him to the monastery that same afternoon. The friars led him to Padre Pio's confessional. Inside, the man wept. He confessed years of anger, years of refusal, years of running from the God he had blamed for everything. And when he emerged, his face was different. The hardness was gone. In its place was peace. In the months that followed, the man who had been so hardened became unrecognizable. He attended Mass every morning. He prayed the rosary daily. He spoke quietly, gently, with a humility that startled everyone who had known him before. The bitterness that had defined him for decades was gone, replaced by something soft and grateful. His daughter could hardly believe it. "We have our father back," she told Padre Pio. "But he is not the same man. He is better than he ever was." Padre Pio listened and smiled gently. He had seen this pattern before. When the friars asked him how Grace had managed to break through after so many years of refusal, his answer became one of his most repeated teachings. "Grace waits for permission," he said, "but it never stops asking." He explained that a hardened heart is not the same as a closed heart. A closed heart refuses because it does not care. A hardened heart refuses because it believes itself unworthy, beyond redemption, too far gone. It builds walls not to keep God out, but to protect itself from the shame of being seen. "Grace shows the soul it was always loved," Padre Pio said. "That is what breaks the walls." He insisted that the longest refusal could end in the deepest conversion. "God is patient," he said. "He does not count the years. He waits for the moment when the soul is ready to breathe again." Years later, Padre Pio returned to this story often. He told it to his spiritual children when they came to him discouraged, believing their prayers for hardened souls were useless. "Never give up on a hardened heart," he would say. "You do not know how close grace is to breaking through." He insisted that the darkest souls were often only one prayer away from light, not because the prayer was powerful in itself, but because it gave heaven permission to act. "We do not save souls," he said. "Grace saves them. We simply make room." Once, a visitor came to him troubled. Her brother had been away from the church for most of his life. She had prayed for years and seen nothing. She asked Padre Pio the question so many had asked before her. "Father, how do you know when a soul is beyond saving?" Padre Pio looked at her seriously. "I don't, and neither does anyone else. Only God knows. So we pray as if every soul can be saved." In his final years, when his hands shook too much to hold his rosary firmly, the friars would see him in his cell, praying quietly for what he called the hardest stones. His voice was weaker, his body frail, but his certainty never wavered. "Grace softens all stones eventually," he said. "Some just take longer." Padre Pio believed that the light of grace could enter any heart, no matter how long it had been closed. He saw it with his own eyes, and for him, that was not a theory. It was a truth he carried until his last breath.